Good evening. I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. As always, please visit our website, weather.gov/Alaska. You can get updates to our forecast or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we might have out for your area. Also call our weather info line, 1-800-472-0391, getting updates to the forecast through that means as well. And you can email me at the address at the bottom of the screen, david.kramer@noaa.gov. We'll start off with the look at the warnings that we do have out. Now, we do have two high wind warnings for the very southern portions of the Panhandle. These are for the southern inner channels and for the southeast Gulf Coast. Now, we do have these high wind warnings out for gusts up to 60 miles per hour. They will start 7 p.m. this evening and then go until 6 a.m. on Wednesday. Again, that's for wind gusts of up to 60 miles per hour. Also, in the same area here, we do have a flood advisory out. Now, this is just around Ward Lake in the southern inner channels, and that is going to be out until 10 a.m. on Thursday. Again, that is a flood advisory around Ward Lake area, just near Ketchikan there. Taking a look at the rest of the map for flooding potential for our breakup map. We do have a couple areas of concern here. We have the Tanana that is mostly open water right now. However, up a little bit to the north in the upper Yukon Valley, upper portions of the Yukon with the colder temperatures that we have been experiencing has kind of stalled some of the breakup up there. But then down in southwest Alaska for the Kuskokwim, we do have some areas starting to see some open water as breakup starts to pick up here. And we do have the River Forecast Center will start to do their flyovers starting tomorrow on Wednesday. Taking a look at our satellite imagery, we'll start off way to the west. We do have low pressure system and front moving through the western and central Aleutian Islands. That band of cloud cover there associated with that occluded boundary, bringing in some mixed precipitation to the islands. We have a weaker low just to the south of the Alaska Peninsula, not really adding a lot of precipitation to the area as it's diminishing and pushing off slowly to the south. However, further to the east, we have another system coming in that's bringing in some rain and helping with those winds out over the southern portions of the Panhandle. We do have the cloud cover extending over all of the Panhandle area there. Then over much of the southern portion of mainland Alaska, we can see some of the clear skies, lack of cloud cover there with some of the fair weather that the southern mainland is experiencing. Taking a look now for the remainder of the day, we'll start off with the low that is over that southeastern portion of the Gulf of Alaska, bringing that strong push of warm air from the south along fetch of moisture there. Some rain for all of the Panhandle area. Some of the areas as we get a little bit further inland starting to be a little bit more of a mix of rain and snow. But with that tighter pressure gradient wrapped around that 989 millibar low, we are seeing some of the potential for those stronger winds in the southeast. As we get over mainland Alaska, as we saw in the satellite, we're seeing a lot of fair weather over southern portions of the mainland, southwest, and much of the interior as well. Some areas of fog underneath high pressure in the Nome area. And then we have some areas of snow lingering along the Arctic coastline, trapped in there by the Brooks Range. As we drop down over the Bering Sea, some isolated showers out by the Pribilof Islands. Otherwise, we have some precipitation coming in with the front associated with that low out by the western Aleutians, bringing in some rain to the central Aleutians, but wrapping in some colder air behind the system, some snow for the western Aleutian Islands. For tonight, that system is going to continue to push off to the east, pulling in some more of that colder air, wrapping in, mixing the rain with snow. So we have a mix of rain and snow for the central and western Aleutians, and that front starting to bring some precipitation to the eastern Aleutian Islands as well. However, that high pressure out near the St. Lawrence Island area, extending that ridging down over the eastern parts of the Bering Sea, are holding up that front from some of its progression to the east, slowing it down somewhat. Out over mainland Alaska, still a lot of areas where we're not seeing a lot of precipitation, but as we get to eastern portions of the interior and then up in the Brooks Range, some lighter areas of snow up there, and then some isolated showers of snow as we get along the Arctic coastline. Our low pressure system out over the Gulf is now pushed a little bit more to the north, bringing in more rain with a continued southerly fetch out over the Panhandle area, expecting more rain for throughout the Panhandle and some mix of rain and snow as we get further to the north in those higher elevation areas. On Wednesday, that low starting to break down now, but still bringing in enough flow off of the Gulf to bring continued rain for the Panhandle area on Wednesday. Again, it's starting to mix with snow at the higher elevations, especially in areas further to the north. Much of mainland Alaska continuing to see a lack of precipitation with the exception of some of the areas further to the east, both in the Alaska Range and up into the eastern portions of the interior. Higher elevations are especially seeing some of that mixed with snow. High pressure out over the Arctic coastline, keeping the area in some fair weather conditions. But then we do have our other high out over St. Lawrence Island area, starting to break down a little bit, but just enough of that ridging continuing to stall out that front as it's trying to push to the east, stalling out over the eastern Aleutians, bringing some rain to the area, starting to bring a mix of rain and snow towards the Pribilof Islands as well, and then some rain and snow showers behind the main front for the western and central Aleutian Islands. As we look into Thursday, that low finally starting to break down now, but still enough to bring a mix of rain and snow to the central and western Aleutians, with the old band there now pushing into the Alaska Peninsula area, bringing a mix of rain and snow to the area, and another low forming off that old frontal boundary, bringing in some rain to the islands to the south. Out over mainland Alaska, high pressure out along the Arctic coastline remaining, with ridging extending out over the northern part of the state, keeping precipitation further to the south and trapped in the Alaska range, where we have a mix of rain and snow, with snow at the higher elevations. Then as we look down into the rest of south central Alaska, some areas of lighter precipitation along the North Gulf Coast, then extending out over the Panhandle as well, where we will still have some areas of rain through much of the Panhandle area, and then further to the north expecting it to mix with snow and some of the colder air. Now looking at our temperatures, starting Wednesday morning in the Panhandle area, temperatures dropping to the lower 40s to right around 40 degrees for the Panhandle, Yakutat down to 36 degrees. Into the 30s for much of south central Alaska, colder in the more interior locations, Talkeetna down to 25, 23 expected for Glen Allen. Up in the interior portions of the state's southern areas, in the 20s, northern locations down into the teens for the most part, with 0 for Arctic Village. But as we get along the Arctic coastline, even colder there, dropping below 0 for most locations until we get far out west, whereas we start to get by Point Hope, expecting into the teens. Then for all of Kotzebue Sound area, right around 16 degrees. For the Norton Sound area, down in the lower 20s, with Gamble getting down to 22 and Nome getting down to 20. Into the 20s for the YK Delta area, and all in the upper 20s for the Bristol Bay area, with Dillingham, Iliamna, and King Salmon all getting down to 29 degrees. Right around freezing for the Alaska Peninsula, and in the mid-30s for the Aleutian Islands, with 31 degrees expected low for St. Paul. So look at our highs for Wednesday afternoon. Pribilof's getting up into the mid-30s, right around 40 degrees for the Aleutian Islands, on Alaska and Atka, both getting up to 40 degrees. Then as we move into the Bristol Bay area, one of the warmest in the state, getting up into the lower 50s there, as well as much of south central Alaska, right in around 50 to those lower 50s. 52 for Homer, as well as King Salmon, Anchorage, and Talkeetna. Then as we move up along the west coast of the state, temperatures dropping as we get further to the north into the 30s for much of the YK Delta area, into the 20s as we get by the Norton Sound and Kotzebue Sounds area. Then up along the Arctic coastline, temperatures getting into the teens out east and then in the 20s out west. In the interior portion of the state, upper 30s to lower 40s. And then as we go down into the Panhandle area, we are going to see temperatures getting up into the mid to upper 40s. 4-hour lows for Thursday morning, dropping right back down to around 40 degrees for the Panhandle. Yakutat a little bit colder, 38 degrees expected low. Into the 30s for South Central, and just like Wednesday morning, we are expecting interior locations like Talkeetna and Glen Allen to drop down into the 20s. Into the 20s for southern locations of the interior, into the teens for northern locations, still getting below 0 for areas along much of the Arctic coastline, till we get to the western locations where we're going to drop down into the teens. Teens for Kotzebue Sound area, 20s for the Norton Sound area, and mid-20s for the YK Delta area, right around 30 degrees for the Bristol Bay area, a little bit warmer at Dillingham, 31 degrees expected low. Then into the mid to lower 30s for the Peninsula, and then down into the mid-30s for the Aleutian Islands, with 31 degrees expected low for St. Paul. Highs for Thursday afternoon getting up to right around 40 degrees for the Aleutians and Alaska Peninsula, right around 50 degrees for much of the Bristol Bay area, into the 40s for the YK Delta, warmer to the south as we get to Aniak and Bethel, both getting up to 47 degrees. Colder as we get to the north, in the 30s for much of the area around the Norton Sound, into the 20s for areas around Kotzebue Sound area, Kotzebue getting up to 29 degrees. Single digits for eastern locations along the Arctic coastline. Then as we get into the interior, upper 30s to lower 40s are expected, right around 50 for south central Alaska, and upper 40s for the Panhandle.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Moving on to flying weather, we're going to be looking at IFR conditions over the northwest Arctic coast, and that extends down into the Kotzebue Sound, north side of the Seward Peninsula, with IFR conditions again across the YK Delta and into Bristol Bay. Otherwise, marginal or IFR conditions across much of the Bering Sea, western Aleutians, and that also will be the same kind of flying conditions across the outside waters that are just offshore of the Panhandle, and marginal VFR conditions in the inside waters of the Panhandle. Otherwise, marginal conditions as you get into the upper Yukon. For Wednesday afternoon, we'll be looking at improving conditions across the northwest Arctic coast. Otherwise, mainland looks pretty good. Marginal conditions across the eastern interior, Alaska Range, eastern Alaska Range. Otherwise, marginal or IFR conditions extensive across much of the Bering Sea. And we get into IFR conditions as you get into the Gulf and outside waters just off the Panhandle, and IFR conditions as you get closer to the coastal mountains. For Thursday morning, looking at marginal conditions there near the Brooks Range and North Slope. Otherwise, IFR conditions again across the Gulf region and into the outside waters of the Panhandle, and again across the coastal mountains. Otherwise, marginal conditions in the inside waters of the Panhandle, and marginal or IFR conditions across much of the Bering Sea. For Thursday afternoon, looks like pretty nice flying conditions across the mainland. Otherwise, IFR conditions across the northeast Gulf Coast, marginal conditions across much of the Panhandle, and again, marginal or IFR conditions across the Bering Sea. And for past conditions, going to be a broken record here with nice weather, nice VFR conditions across many of the passes: Anaktuvik VFR, Adigan VFR, Lake Clark Merrill VFR, Rainy VFR, Windy VFR, Isabel VFR, and Mentasta VFR, Tanita VFR as well. Portage VFR, the only place that's going to give anybody any troubles is Chilkoot or White Pass with IFR conditions. For freezing levels, Wednesday morning, surface freezing level comes across the Bering Sea and into the Alaska Peninsula, cuts across the south central area and into the Panhandle. 2,000 foot elevation there, cuts across the same kind of pattern there and into the Panhandle. Otherwise, elevated freezing levels across portions of the Yukon Territory. Icing conditions for Wednesday, looking for about 7,000 feet across much of the Panhandle and into the northern Gulf region, with considerable moderate conditions. In the Panhandle, above 5,000 feet as you get into the eastern Aleutians. And for the jet stream, looking for Wednesday, 150 knot winds just south of Aleutians, 75 knots as you get into the central Aleutians. Otherwise, as you come across the Arctic coast there, 75 knots, 35 knots as you get into south central region, and 45 knots as you get out towards the YK Delta. Lastly, across the Panhandle, 100 knots across the southern end of the Panhandle, 50 knots in the central Panhandle. Again, for Wednesday, for 9,000 foot winds generally from the southwest, 30 to 35 across the Panhandle, with 50 to 45 knots as you get into Canada, and again around the low pressure system in the western Bering, 55 knots as you get close to the western Aleutians, 35 knots in the eastern Aleutians. For 3,000 foot winds on Wednesday around a low pressure system, 45 knots in the Panhandle, 25 knots just outside on the coastal waters. Otherwise, going to be looking at around the low pressure system, 55 knots in the central Bering Sea, western Aleutians, 40 knots as you get into the central and eastern Aleutians. Winds light and variable across much of the mainland for Wednesday, just across the eastern Brooks Range, 30 knots there. For the turbulence, looking below 5,000 feet across the Panhandle, with considerable moderate in some areas, and also below 4,000 feet as you get into the western Aleutians.
Welcome to another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider, and joining us once again is our good friend Eric Stevens from GINA, the Geographic Information Network of Alaska. He is here and has been here many times to talk to us about weather satellites and how those can help Alaskans understand our weather, how we can do better detection, keep more people safe from things even like volcanic ash. But today, Eric, you're going to talk to us a little bit more about weather satellites and how that can keep Alaskans safe and protect our property from wildfire, right?
That's right, Dave. Today's topic is where there's smoke, there's fire. And thanks for having us back again to Alaska
Anytime.
Weather. Well, weather satellites have a lot of different instruments on them. It turns out that the electromagnetic spectrum has a lot going on in it, and only one part of that is visible light, what we see.
Right.
Weather satellites, of course, report that. Today's topic is wildfires.
Okay.
There are some people who say that in Alaska in the summertime you don't have severe weather. These people are usually from Oklahoma or somewhere, and F5 tornadoes tend not to occur in Alaska.
Right.
People have also said what we do have in the summer. What is Alaska's severe summer weather can be hydrology,
Right.
flash flood and erosion in the mountains and things like that, and fires, wildfires.
Absolutely.
Those were here in 2004, certainly remember that. We've got an example here from 2014. Now it was a quiet season overall, but in May, down on the Kenai Peninsula, we had a wildfire on the Funny River, and this is a satellite image from a polar orbiter that went right over Alaska, and we can see the plume of smoke coming out of that fire on the Kenai, curling down. It's caught in the wind.
Right.
It goes down toward Kodiak Island, curves around. You can see it circulating around a low pressure system that's in the Gulf of Alaska.
It was a beautiful picture.
Oh my gosh.
Except there was a fire.
There's a fire there. The nice thing is with this satellite image, you can tell where the fire origin is, where the
Right.
smoke is coming from. And it's a color image. We're looking at the wavelength spectrum of about 0.4 to 0.7 micrometers or microns. That's what the human eye would see. If you were riding on the satellite and looked down, you could see this kind of an image.
Right.
So that's pretty nice. But it turns out there's more to the electromagnetic spectrum than just visible light.
Okay.
You've heard of infrared, ultraviolet, that kind of thing. If we move into longer wavelengths, let's go to one specifically, 3.7 micron.
Okay, 3.7.
Why worry about that one? Well, we've got an example here. 3.7, it turns out, happens to be very sensitive to a certain temperature range, temperatures where fires burn.
Okay.
And so we've got an example zoomed in a little more from that same Funny River fire down on the Kenai Peninsula, and we can see that you get up into a few hundred degrees Fahrenheit,
Right.
and that's where the colors are. We can see there on the Funny River fire to the west and to the east, almost a horseshoe shape there, is not only we're seeing where the fire is in a general sense, but specifically where it's the active fire
That is where
front.
it's burning right now.
And it's
Amazing.
3.7 microns is the important temperature there.
Okay.
That's right.
So this is really important to firefighters on the ground, people that are making plans and directing the firefighters on where they need to go and cut the trenches and keep people safe.
You know it. If you want to fight that fire, you got to know where it is.
Okay.
You got to know the leading edge. We've also got a movie loop, nothing quite like animating it in time.
Yeah.
You can see the fire spreading out over time with a succession of film or succession of images. Now this is one channel, 3.7 micron. You know, we looked at that color smoke image before.
Right.
And that's actually a red, a green, and a blue. That's how you get color imagery. What if you took 3 different wavelengths in the infrared? You went from like 2.2 micron, 1.5 micron, up to 3.7. You mix them together, you get this other kind of color image, which is even a better way to sharply bring out the details of where that leading edge of the fire is.
Okay.
You'll note, though, in the infrared, guess what? We don't see the smoke. That's too bad. And on these movie loops, you can see the clouds go by. These channels can't see through clouds. The lesson is there's no one perfect solution. You got to have the visible, you got to have some of that infrared single 3.7 channel, some of the infrared mixing to help get a different perspective. Another one, we've talked before about a fun channel called the day-night band.
Yes, one of my favorites.
Oh yeah, and in Alaska in the winter, it's great. We got all this darkness. The day-night band is so sensitive to seeing light. You can see features that otherwise aren't available. Now in Alaska, when you have a forest fire, it tends to be light out all the time.
Right.
It's our summer. But we can go down south to the Rim Fire in California in 2013. Now, okay, it was in California, not Alaska, but Alaskan crews went down to fight that fire, so we
Fair
can talk
enough.
about it here on Alaska Weather. Here we have a 3.7 micron channel shot of the rim fire, again kind of a horseshoe shape showing that active fire front down there, and then we'll look again to the day-night band the visible light, and then you can see how the fire is all bright. You can see the active fire front and actually the city lights over there too. Turns out that the cities, while they're active in a social sense, are not really hot in a fire sense. So they don't show up in the 3.7 micron. They're not hot like a fire is, but the fire in the cities look the same from a visible light perspective. And a fun thing here too is that we can see the smoke plume going north from the rimfire on the day-night band. So if we were ever to have, like in 2004 in Alaska, you get dark at night, we still had an active fire season that year.
Right,
that was, you know, that really bad year. The day-night band didn't exist then, but if we had fires now in August, we could use it then. The lesson here is weather satellites, they offer many different wavelengths of light. Some are used for different purposes, and some of these that we just looked at tonight are especially helpful here in Alaska to find and to track the behavior of these wildfires so the crews can go out there and do their jobs.
Sure, sure. So a satellite toolbox for the firefighting crews and the fire weather forecasters, and it just underlines how important satellites are, especially for Alaska and our mission for the National Weather Service to protect life and property, and also to enhance the national economy. So wonderful stuff there, Eric. And people can look at pictures like this anytime by going to gina.alaska.edu. You'll find images there all around Alaska at various times of the year, and not just about fire weather, but volcanic ash and smoke and anything else you want to check out. They're always beautiful pictures and always interesting to look at no matter what time of the day. Thanks again for joining us, Eric. We appreciate it and welcome you back anytime. For this edition of Alaska Weather Facts, I'm meteorologist Dave Snider. See you next time. And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Let's take a look at the sea ice for the analysis today on April 28th. You can see some Pleionias opening up on the south side of Nunivak Island and also St. Lawrence Island, also in Norton Sound, some of the lower concentrations of ice. We continue to expect some of that southern progress of ice with the northerly flow across much of the Bering Sea. And moving on to Wednesday's marine forecast, inside waters, looking at winds generally from the south, 15 to 30 knots, seas as high as 8 feet in the southern end of there. Outside waters, looking at winds generally from a southerly direction, 30 knots there. Over the northern portions of the outside waters, winds generally from the north or east at 15 to 25 knots. Otherwise, in the northern part of the up near Cordova, winds from the east at 10 knots. Seas as high as 17 feet there in the southern outside waters. And for Thursday, going to be looking at 10 to 15 knots generally from the south. In the inside waters, seas as high as 4 feet, and outside waters, winds generally from the south, 15 to 20 knots, seas as high as 9 feet. For South Central, Wednesday's forecast, winds generally from the the west at 10 to 15 knots, seas as high as 8 feet in the Cook Inlet region. Winds generally from the west, again 10 to 15, with seas as high as 3 feet. For Thursday, winds generally from the north over Prince William Sound, northern Gulf of Alaska there, 10 knots, seas as high as 6 feet. As you get into the southern portions of those waters, winds generally from the east, 10 to 15, seas as high as 6 feet, just south of Seward. And for the Cook Inlet, winds generally from the north, 10 to 15 knots. Otherwise from the east, as you get into the Barren Islands, from the east at 15 knots, seas as high as 4 feet. For the Alaska Peninsula, on the south side, around Kodiak Island, winds generally from the east at 15 knots. Same for the south side of the Alaska Peninsula, seas from the west at 15 knots, seas as high as 5 feet. North side of the Alaska Peninsula, winds generally from the from the southwest at 10 knots. Otherwise from the west and Bristol Bay area to 10 knots. And for Thursday, going to be looking at winds generally from the south for much of the region. Seas as high as 6 feet. Winds generally from the south at 10 to 15 knots. And for Aleutian Chain, winds generally from the west at 20 to 35 knots as you get out there towards the western end of the Aleutians. Seas as high as 21 feet out there. And for Thursday, Aleutian Chain, winds generally from the southwest at 10 to 15 knots with 25 knots just south of Atka, seas as high as 12 feet. Over the western end of the Aleutians, winds generally from the west at 25 to 30 knots, seas as high as 14 feet. For the west coast, winds generally from the north at 10 knots, seas as high as 8 feet on the other side of the ice edge. And for Thursday, again, winds from the north, 15 knots, seas as high as 8 feet on the outer edge of the ice edge. And for Wednesday's Arctic coast, winds generally from the east at 5 to 15 knots, all the way through much of the area, even down through the strait. Winds generally from the east at 5 to 15 knots. And for the Arctic coast on Thursday, you're going to be looking at winds generally from the east at 20 to 25 knots, and southerly from there at just off the Arctic coast from the south at 10 knots, and around Seward Peninsula and just off the shores of Kivalina, winds generally from the east at 15 knots. And for tonight's weather, going to be looking at a 989 millibar low in the Bering Sea with mixed precipitation throughout much of the region, and a 993 millibar low near the the Panhandle, with rain showers in the area, mixed precipitation as you move further inland. And for Wednesday, 990 low in the Bering, mixed precipitation in the Bering Sea, and 998 low near Panhandle, with rain showers and mixed precipitation as you move into Canada.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.